All right, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our final NACSAM webinar. As you've already heard, we'd love it if you would mute your lines so we don't get any extraneous noise during the webinar. We have quite a few participants today and want to make sure that everyone has the chance to hear the content. My name is Cheryl Levy. I'm with Clery Center. My colleague Amy Guthrie and I will be working in the background on the technical aspect of things. I'm just going to take you through a little bit what you're seeing on your screen, and then we'll get started. So you'll see on the main screen is the presentation that we'll be going through during today's webinar. Just to the right of that screen are some files that you can download. Excuse me, these are free resources provided by Clery Center and our partners on today's webinar, so you're certainly welcome to access those here. At the bottom left of your screen, you'll see a section called Group Discussion. During the course of the webinar, the presenters will likely be asking questions and looking for responses, similar to when I asked you all to say yes, that you could hear me. Responses that you're typing there are visible by all the participants on the webinar. There's also a section to the right of that called Tech Support. Anything you type there is visible only to the presenters. If you're having technical issues, you can let us know there, and Amy or I will try and troubleshoot those issues with you. If you have a question that you want to ask of the presenters rather than the whole group, you can type those there as well. Our presenters, our Clery Center team will be monitoring those questions and parsing them out to the right people to answer them. Please be aware that the team is multitasking and presenting information to you during the webinar at the same time that they're monitoring those questions. So if I can ask you to have a little patience with them, and I promise that they do monitor them, that they respond to questions there. It just isn't always instantaneous. We are recording today's webinar, and the recording will be available next week on the NACSAM website. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Laura Egan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our final National Campus Safety Awareness Month webinar of 2019. As many of you might know from tuning into previous webinars, this year's theme has been Bridging the Gap, which has been our attempt at connecting theory to practice for various areas of campus safety and Clery Act compliance. And today I feel like we have an extremely popular topic, connecting the idea of how to best accomplish a biennial review to your overall compliance with both the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, and then ultimately the Clery Act as well. So we are really encouraged by the number of attendees we have signed up for today's webinar. Thank you all again so much for joining us. As Cheryl really helpfully addressed, just reminder to all of you that there are a lot of you on, and there's only a few of us, and one of us or more of us will be talking at the same time. So we do want to encourage you to ask questions throughout. We've actually carved out some question asking times throughout the webinar so that we're not saving it all to the end. But just be conscientious that if you're experiencing a slight delay in our response time, it's only because we just have a lot of people on the webinar and we are only 3 people responding. So we just ask for your patience with that. Certainly, though, if there are questions that remain unanswered at the conclusion of the webinar, feel free to reach out to any of us. We will include our contact information at the end as well. But today I am joined by 2 wonderful colleagues. Oh, I guess I should tell you about myself a little bit first. Sorry, this is Laura, Senior Director of Programs at the Clery Center. I've been here for 4 years now, and I have a background in working both as a school counselor in an elementary school and in student conduct and residence life roles at a college as well. And so my lens of student-centered and student development-based work is framed by having a lot of intersections with campus safety professionals in all of my roles thus far. So the conversation we'll be having today is extremely topical and relevant for a lot of different folks on a college campus, whether you're doing that prevention work, whether you're doing compliance work, whether you're working directly with students or you're an upper-level administrator that does not work with students as much. The topic is hopefully beneficial to all of you. So I hope to bring my lens and background to make that even more relevant for you as well. But like I was getting into, we are so excited to be joined by Mike DeBowes from D. Stafford and Associates and NACUP, the National Association of Clery Compliance Officers and Professionals, as well as David Arnold from NASPA, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, and two just great minds in the field of the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act and then prevention and response efforts around drug and alcohol prevention, drug and alcohol use as well. And so I would love to give them each a chance to introduce themselves further. Mike, why don't you take it away for us?
Thanks so much, Laura. Again, as Laura said, my name is Mike DeBowes, and I am duly employed through D. Stafford and Associates, which is a consulting firm that does work in regulatory compliance, including Clery, drug-free schools, Title IX, other areas affecting campus safety broadly. And I also serve as the Director of Research and Strategic Initiatives for the National Association of Clery Compliance Officers and Professionals. I, too, have a background in student conduct. I spent the better part of a decade at 2 different institutions of higher education in a student conduct office, most recently at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, where I served as the Director of their Student Conduct and Academic Integrity Office. So thrilled to join you today. And talk with you, Laura, and David about these issues, which are all of mutual interest to us. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Of course, of course. Thank you so much for being here, Mike. And David, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. And good afternoon and good morning to everyone. My name is David Arnold. I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Health, Safety, and Wellbeing Initiatives with NASPA. If you're not familiar, NASPA is a professional organization whose member representatives are on campuses in student services and student affairs across the country and internationally. And I actually joined the NASPA team as part of the Bacchus team that was brought over in the 2014 merger. And prior to that, I was the person that the Mike and Laura's of the world would send your drug and alcohol students towards. I did drug and alcohol counseling and prevention services on campuses for a solid decade prior to moving into the association world. And drug-free schools is honestly one of my favorite things to talk about because it has so much potential to serve the work that we do. And I think that you couldn't ask for a better group than Laura, Mike, and myself to be guiding you all through this conversation. I'm really stoked to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David. So, everyone, today, like I mentioned, we are gathered to talk through some things related to the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, particularly examining what biennial reviews are and how you can best execute them at your own campus. And before we get there, we're just going to take a moment to explain why Clery Center's National Campus Safety Awareness Month programming is centered around this topic. For those of you that might not know, the Clery Center is a national nonprofit training organization founded by the parents of Jeanne Clery, who was a student at Lehigh University when in the spring of her freshman year, April of 1986, she was raped and murdered in her residence hall room. And her parents were obviously devastated by this loss and wanted to try to do anything to make sure that no other lives had to be unnecessarily lost in that same way. And so they both founded Clery Center and then worked to develop legislation at the local and state level that ultimately turned into the federal law we know today as the Clery Act. And we do try to focus each webinar on why we're here and our founding, because we know that for all of you, there is a reason why you are choosing to do the work you are doing, whether it's a person, whether it's a cause, whether it's your own experiences, or that of a friend or family member or colleague. There is a reason why you choose to do work that is connected to safety and violence prevention or substance use work and substance prevention and response work. And so when you can get in the weeds, it can become really distracting from that initial cause or reason that drew you to the work. And so we wanted to try to give you all both a moment to reflect on why you do the work that you do, to give yourself some pause to take that breath and to realize that you are valuable in the work that you are doing, and for us to say thank you to you for choosing the work that you are engaging in, because as David said, you know, that this work is instrumental on college campuses today, and it always has been, it probably will always be, and sometimes though the most valuable work is going unnoticed or not as recognized, and so we wanted to take a chance to both thank you and then give you permission to take a moment during the next hour, hour and a half to reflect on what you currently do, what maybe you could do a little bit better, what you are wanting to celebrate, and what you need some help with. And sometimes by taking a minute to remember why you're doing it in the first place allows you and gives you that permission to think a little bit more critically in that way. So thank you for indulging us in that. Thank you. As a reminder, you know, Clery Center is guided by these principles that we really find it beneficial to work in partnership with colleges and universities so that we're not only focusing on what others are doing wrong, but what we all need support in doing better, because that way we all are achieving the ultimate goal of not just compliance with a law, but creating safer campuses for all people. And so while a law might help guide us in that way and provide a blueprint, for some people, complying with the law seems a little bit hollow or not as dynamic. And so what we like to try to bring to the conversation is both the fact that we are concentrating on the small things, but also that the law of Clery and a law like actually the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act is actually kind of dynamic. It's not like maybe a typical bureaucratic law in that way, because it has evolved. It has received feedback over time, and it has turned into something that we hope is a little bit more comprehensive in how it talks about campus safety, prevention, and response efforts. So today what we're hoping to do is provide some clarity on how the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act and the Clery Act are connected. Then we are going to review the DFSCA requirements, particularly around the what and how of the biennial review itself. Mike will lead us through a lot of that conversation. And then we want to identify common challenges institutions face in doing the biennial review and strategies that prevention professionals can use to support or manage the review process. And then lastly, we'll share some options for how you can represent your DFSCA information within the currently popular document, the Annual Security Report. We know we are approaching a high deadline for that ASR, as it needs to be published by October 1st, which is next Tuesday. So we're going to spend some time speaking to how you can best capture information around DFSCA within that document. During the webinar, like Cheryl talked about initially, there are multiple ways for you all to interact with us. We're going to be using some polls at certain times to gauge or do a quick temperature check from the audience about certain questions. We will also ask questions of you that you can share your answers with us through that group discussion pod that you can see right here. We'll also share some highlighted resources through this files pod over here. We already have the handout version of the slides and the ASR review checklist included. I'm sorry, not the ASR review checklist, a document that is connecting how you represent the DFSCA requirements within your ASR here for you to review. And then lastly, you can ask us questions, and you can ask them through the group discussion pod where everyone can see what you're writing, or you could include them in the support or private Q&A pod where then only the presenters would see that question. So to get things started, we would love to begin with a quick poll here. So as you'll see, that is being loaded right now, and you'll be able to answer this question. Please share with us whether or not you have read your institution's Drug and Alcohol Abuse Prevention Program annual notification, so your institution's DAAPP, which should be shared with the entire campus community each year. Oh, and you are some fast poll responders. This is fantastic. When you have fewer people, somehow it takes folks longer to respond to this poll. When you have a lot of people, you respond a lot more quickly. So this is great. As you can all see, the answers are coming in live. So most people, in fact, 3/4 of you are saying that yes, you have read that document, which is phenomenal. This is great. We probably can pause that poll any second now, Cheryl. Thank you all for those of you that took the time to respond. And so why we ask that is because we all want to first be on the same page with what we're talking about here today. So one of the things that the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act highlights is the need for institutions of higher education that receive federal funding to compose a drug and alcohol abuse prevention program. That program has certain required elements, and Mike's going to walk through them as well. But that is something that all campuses that receive that federal funding must have in place to address and speak to and educate on drug and alcohol use and abuse for its population, or its students and employees. And so if you only learned that for the first time right now, that's okay. If you've known that for 25 years, that's also okay. We want to just make sure that when we are using a lot of acronyms today that we're all on the same page. It might be helpful to have that DAAPP handy as we talk through some more of the requirements, although it is certainly not necessary. But you'll see as soon as Mike gets to his section as well that when we are talking about this biennial review, that biennial review is evaluating the effectiveness of that DAAPP. So in order to appropriately understand how to evaluate something, you've got to know what you're evaluating first. So that would be that DAAPP. So it's good to have an awareness of that. We are not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Clery Act itself today. This is a slide to provide you with a general overview. It's a slide we use frequently in many of our webinars. But so we are all on the same page, just so you all know, the Clery Act is a federal consumer protection law that applies to any institution of higher education in the United States that receives Title IV federal financial aid, which is, for the most part, many, many colleges and universities. I say it's written as a consumer protection law as a point of note because it really is all about promoting transparency and accountability between institutions of higher education and its constituents, so its students or its employees. This law asks for certain individuals that are identified as campus security authorities or local law enforcement to disclose information to campuses about Clery crimes, so crimes that are defined within the law itself, that took place within certain aspects of buildings or property that are defined in one of 4 categories within the law, also known as Clery Act geography. So in composing those statistics, that is just one element of the Clery Act. Institutions must put that information, those statistics, in a document called the Annual Security Report, as well as report them directly to the Department of Education each year, annually by October 1st. And then similarly, that Annual Security Report includes a summary of policies that exist currently at a campus that speak to different areas of campus safety. We're not going to get into what all of those are today, but one of those areas of speaking to policy is connected to alcohol and drug policies and then programs that you have in place. In an ongoing capacity, campuses are required to evaluate reports that come through to determine if they require a timely warning or an emergency notification, and then they are including those reports within their daily crime log if they occur within an institution's patrol jurisdiction. And then on top of that, ever since the VAWA amendments to Clery, also in an ongoing capacity, campuses are ensuring that certain rights and options are in place for victims or survivors of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. It's also really important to note that the Clery Center does not enforce the Clery Act. Again, we are that nonprofit training organization. The Clery Act is enforced by the Clery Compliance Division within the Department of Education. And because the law is written as a consumer protection law, that division is actually within the Office of Federal Student Aid. And so I say all of that to get to this lovely point. So how does DFSCA or the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act connect to Clery? So the Clery Act is part of a larger law called the Higher Education Act, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. As institutions have to publish information already related to drug and alcohol prevention and response for both DFSCA and Clery requirements, and as both of these laws are enforced by the same office within the Department of Education, which Mike will get to in a moment as well, the laws are often discussed together. And so with Clery, within an annual security report, you need to always disclose within it a summary of the institution's policies on possession, use, and sale of alcohol and illegal drugs. You also need to speak to how, if at all, your institution enforces state underage drinking laws and state and federal drug laws. And then you also need to speak to your institution's drug and alcohol abuse prevention program by either including all of the information about that within your ASR or cross-referencing to materials the institution uses to comply with DFSCA. We'll come back to those points at the end, but in addition to all of that, so as you can see that the information needs to be in both Clery and in DFSCA, and again, as both Clery and DFSCA are enforced by the Department of Education, we are going to talk further about how those laws are intersecting and then how and why it makes sense for the folks that are involved with Clery compliance on your campus to at least have a working knowledge of what is required under DFSCA, particularly around this biennial review, so that they can best support those that are doing that work on a campus. Technically, the actual biennial review does not need to be within an institution's ASR, but it might be part of the materials that the institution ultimately cross-references to. But we'll get into those distinctions in a moment once Mike walks through the requirements a little bit further. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Mike, who is going to talk to you a little bit about the history of DFSCA and its overall requirements. So Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Laura. In composing what part of the history to review today, I'm going to just jump ahead about 15 years beyond the law's initial effective date, which was passed in 1989, went into effect in 1990. And the story is really going to begin with the two students that are shown in this photo. On the left is a woman named Christine Guest. In 2005, she was a 20-year-old sophomore attending Quinnipiac University, and she was visiting a friend who's shown on the right, Joshua Rao, who was a student at Paul Smith's College of Arts and Sciences in upstate New York. And Joshua had invited Christine and two of their friends to join him at Paul Smith's to help celebrate his 20th birthday. And so I just want to briefly tell you a story that helps connect Christine specifically to the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act and talks a little bit about the why behind the law, but also gives you a sense for how the modern enforcement era really came to be. So February 2005, Christine and her friends are visiting Joshua and to celebrate his birthday. They go out for dinner off campus. They come back to Joshua's residence hall room, and they start participating in a drinking game. And as the night progresses, the group veers down to a nearby lake. It's the Lower St. Regis Lake. It was actually approximately 15 steps away from the front door of Joshua's residence hall. And the lake is frozen over. The group joins approximately 80 other people who are out on the frozen lake. There's a bonfire. Alcohol is widely available. At some point during the evening, the director of residence life and a campus safety officer actually come down to the lake to investigate a report of an earlier snowmobile accident involving people on the lake. And at that point, as we would learn in a subsequent lawsuit, the college officials advised that the students who were there should be safe, keep the speed down on snowmobiles, and to call campus safety if there were any problems. Well, later that night, at about 4 o'clock in the morning, Joshua was able to persuade a friend that had a snowmobile to let Joshua borrow it to take his guests out onto the lake for a brief snowmobile ride. And indeed he did. The first two guests he took one at a time without incident, and then Joshua offered Christine the opportunity to accompany him on a ride on the lake. And she agreed. They went out, and shortly thereafter, when they didn't return within an expected time frame, some of the students went looking for them, and they discovered that there had been a tragic accident involving the snowmobile that resulted in the immediate death of both Joshua and Christine. A subsequent New York State Police report indicated that alcohol was a contributing factor in the deaths of Joshua and Christine. And Christine's parents, of course, were devastated. And as they learned more about the events that night in the early morning hours, they formed a belief that the college had been negligent in their duties of care. And so they filed a civil suit, which was unsuccessful, as was their subsequent appeal, trying to hold the college accountable for what they perceived to be some inadequacies in their monitoring and supervision of students that particular night. And so grieving parents, finding some doors closing when the lawsuits failed, they decided to reach out to their senator, Connecticut Senator Christopher Dodd. And his office conducted an informal investigation, and he ended up writing the Department of Education concerning the college's compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act requirements. And shortly after receiving that request, the department, in fact, initiated a review of Paul Smith's college compliance with both the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act as well as the Clery Act. Ultimately, the college was found out of compliance with Clery, but in compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, which, when Senator Dodd learned of this, he found to be a disturbing outcome. And so this time, he reached out to fellow Congressman John Larson, and they collectively wrote the Department of Education Inspector General, and they requested that the Inspector General review the department's monitoring and enforcement efforts with respect to the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. And indeed, that is something that the department would eventually take up. In the letter that they wrote to the Inspector General requesting this review, they wondered out loud, since Paul Smith's College had been found to be in compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, including with respect to a requirement pertaining to consistent sanctioning of students and employees who commit violations, they wondered, what does the college need to do to be out of compliance? And so the Inspector General did indeed commission a review of the department's enforcement practices. But before that review was concluded, two significant developments occurred. First, in June of 2010, the responsibility for oversight shifted from an office in the department to the Office of Federal Student Aid, which, as Laura indicated, that is the entity that now is responsible both for monitoring compliance with the Clery Act, but also, as of June 2010, the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. The second major development occurred when, in 2011, a very prominent Dear Colleague letter was issued to all institutions of higher education. Might not be the one that you're thinking of. The one that I'm referencing occurred in September of 2011, more than 7 months after the Dear Colleague letter that's since been rescinded on sexual violence. The Secretary of Education joined the director of President Obama's National Drug Control Strategy in penning a letter that went out to all institutions. And that letter specifically reminded institutions of their decades-old responsibility for complying with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, and it warned that the department was going to undertake enhanced monitoring of institutional compliance with these requirements. And indeed, they did. One of the things that's important to note is that as the Inspector General report came out, the department had been amending their procedures for reviewing compliance. And ultimately, the Federal Student Aid Unit had conducted a number of compliance-focused reviews following that redesignation of responsibility. And so when the results of the review came out, in effect, we would learn from the Inspector General review that for the first 2 decades of the law's existence, essentially there was no enforcement whatsoever on the part of the Department of Education. And so what they did was they took a look at a sample of cases that federal student aid had overseen, and they looked at the effectiveness of those reviews. And what they found was that less than 20% of the reviews included in their sample properly documented noncompliance with the requirements of the law. The rest of the reviews either didn't document the rationale for the department's findings, or the information available to the Inspector General showed that institutions that had been found in compliance were actually out of compliance. And so to say it was an embarrassment and a stain on the department would be an understatement. So the Chief Operating Officer responded to that report and pledged to enhance their training of their federal student aid auditors, and their processes, and we began to see the fruits of that labor in November of 2014, which for the first time since the law was passed in 1989, an institution was actually issued a fine for violating the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. That was noteworthy because if you read the regulations as to the potential remedies for Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act violations, you'll see that a fine is not included amongst the remedies. But because of the way that fines are attached to Title IV programs, the department was able to use fines as a tool to both penalize noncompliance and try to incentivize compliance. And so since November 2014, we've seen 36 institutions that have been fined nearly $750,000 for Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act violations, and that's happened during a period of time in which the maximum fine in effect at the time was either $27,500 per violation or $35,000 per violation. And as of February of this year, as a result of the Inflation Adjustment Act, the current amount of fines that an institution could face for violating either the Clery Act or the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act is $57,317. So certainly the cost of noncompliance has skyrocketed in the last couple of years, particularly since that first fine was made publicly available. So we know that there are a number of other pending reviews that the department has referred for fines. We'll continue to monitor those. But suffice it to say that the department has made compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act one of their focal areas in compliance reviews. And so we would certainly encourage you to continue to look at how you're complying with the requirements of the law and make sure that moving forward, you're doing all the things that you're supposed to do. So in that spirit, we wanted to briefly talk about what are the requirements of the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act to provide some context for the biennial review, which we'll spend most of our time focusing on today. So there are essentially three major requirements. Now, the first requirement that is actually not on this slide, sort of the precursor, is that your institution signs what's called the Program Participation Agreement with the U.S. Department of Education. That is essentially the contract that enables your institution to participate in Title IV federal financial aid programs. And in exchange for that, your institution pledges to comply with a variety of statutes and regulations that are promulgated by the department. Well, that includes compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. So there is a certification requirement that happens in the background whenever your chief executive officer of the institution signs that program participation agreement to renew your eligibility. That chief executive officer is actually pledging that your institution fully understands and is in full compliance with the requirements of the law. So know that in the background, that's the premise with which the Department of Ed is conducting program reviews to essentially test the truthfulness of those attestations in that program document. So the three major requirements that most of you will see in your day-to-day worlds involve first and foremost developing a compliant drug and alcohol abuse prevention program, which, as Laura indicated, the Department of Ed refers to that as your DAAPP. So when we talk about that acronym, we're talking about that specific policy document, and it has to contain certain elements that I'll be reviewing in just a moment. But once you've developed your DAAPP, then you have an obligation to distribute it. So also, as Laura had mentioned, each year you should be distributing the DAAPP to all students who are enrolled and all employees. And so this is different from the annual security report, and for many of you, the annual fire safety reports you're preparing to publish and distribute by no later than October 1st, because a once-a-year dissemination of your DAAPP will rarely, if ever, reach all required recipients, because this is not a one-time only distribution. This is something that you must have procedures in place to provide reasonable assurance that every student who's enrolled at any point during the year and every employee who is employed at any point during the year, regardless of when they're hired, will be provided with a DAAPP. So there's some enhanced distribution requirements that are different from your annual security reports. Nevertheless, once you've developed a DAAPP and you've implemented procedures to distribute the DAAPP, you're in a position now to meet the third major challenge of complying with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, which is to conduct a biennial review of the effectiveness of your DAAPP. And again, we're going to talk a lot about that in the course of what remains in the webinar. But I just want to point out that these requirements have somewhat of a logical order. In fact, the Department of Ed talks about these in program reviews and in technical assistance environments as being stackable. You have to first develop your DAAPP. And so you need a fully formed, materially complete DAAPP in a document that then must be distributed to all students and employees. And once you've developed your DAAPP and you've distributed your DAAPP, you're now in a position to evaluate its effectiveness. And so a failure in compliance at an earlier level means it is quite literally not possible to fully comply with subsequent requirements. So building a compliant DAAPP is the foundation, then implementing procedures to distribute it, and then implementing procedures to evaluate it. So keep that in mind, and that's part of the reason why what we're going to do now is pivot to just talking about what the requirements are of a compliant DAAPP. So there are 5 key elements that must be included. We've put those on this and the next slide. They come right out of the department's implementing regulations, which, by the way, sometimes you'll hear people refer to, or you might read a reference to the Part 86 regulations. That is simply referencing the place in the department's general administrative regulations where the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act requirements sit. So we talk about the DFSCA or Part 86. Those are largely interchangeable ways of referencing the same thing. So your DAAPP first must include standards of conduct that apply to all students and all employees that, at a minimum, prohibit the unlawful possession, use, or distribution of both illicit drugs and alcohol. And these prohibitions apply to not only students, but also to employees. And they extend not only to your campus, as that is defined under Clery, but also to any institution-associated activities involving students or employees. And that is true independent, by the way, of whether you own or control the location where those activities are occurring, i.e. it does not matter if they are non-campus locations under Clery that would trigger reporting. It's the mere existence of an institution-related activity that means these standards of conduct must follow students and employees to. So these are the minimum that every institution in the country, whether you're public, private, large, small, residential, commuter, does not matter. Everyone has to follow those same minimum standards. But if your institution develops other standards of conduct that are applicable to your students or employees, then your DAAPP is expected to include those standards, because at the end of the day, the expectation of the Department of Ed is that your DAAPP is going to put members of your campus community on notice about what conduct is permissible and impermissible as it relates to the use or abuse of alcohol and other drugs. So that is really the foundational component, is identifying what are the prohibited conduct activities for students and employees that relate to those substances. Next, what you have to do is provide a description of any legal sanctions that a person might face under local law, state law, or federal law. So we're not yet talking about disciplinary sanctions that your institution may impose on a student or an employee who violates the laws related to possession or distribution of alcohol and illicit drugs. We're talking about the legal sanctions that exist outside of your institutions in the criminal justice system, principally. So this is important because all 3 levels of sanctions have to be addressed in your DAAPP. When I conduct reviews of institutions' DAAPPs, I often find that the state laws may be relatively well addressed, but the federal legal sanctions are missing, and often there's no indication at all as to what legal sanctions may exist at the local level, if any. So if you do have your DAAPPs nearby and you're just skimming through those during this webinar, as Laura suggested, I would encourage you to make sure that you see all 3 tiers of legal sanctions in that document. I would also just note that the notion of campuses here matters. This is an institutional requirement. If you have campuses in multiple states or jurisdictions, that should be reflected in identifying what state laws and ordinances at the local level you include in your DAAPP that relate to unlawful possession or distribution of alcohol or illicit drugs. So keep that in mind. You are also required to provide a description of applicable health risks associated with the use of illicit drugs and the abuse of alcohol. Abuse is not defined in the law. It's for the institution to define. But you're essentially expected to identify what are the harmful effects of these substances. The way the department has talked about this in the initial regulations that were published in 1990 and in some of the guidance that has been published since is they expect you to really talk about the major categories of substances that are regulated under the Controlled Substances Act, as well as alcohol, which is not, and talk about the effects on the mind, the effects on the body, the effects of overdose, both from a short-term and long-term perspective. So a really hearty discussion in your DAAPP as to the various health-related risks and consequences that exist for using and or abusing these substances. So this is not just a paragraph or two that's going to cut it in your descriptions. The department also expects that as part of a compliant DAAPP, you will include a description of any alcohol or drug-related counseling, treatment, rehabilitation, or reentry programs that might be available to your students or employees. So for some of you, this may mean you have a counseling center and you're going to talk about what resources are available in terms of psychoeducational groups or short-term solution-focused therapy or referrals out to community providers. And you'll probably talk at a minimum, most of you, about an employee assistance program and what alcohol or drug-related services are available there. You're not required under the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act to provide these types of resources. Rather, you're required to talk about what of these resource types or program types do you have, if any, for students and employees. In the event you have none, then you would be required to talk about what options may exist in the local community. Again, this might be an area of your DAAPP that is going to be informed by the footprint in which your institution has some presence in terms of jurisdictions, right? So if you have some resources that are only available to certain groups affiliated with certain campuses, you would want to make that clear in your DAAPP. Finally, the final requirement of a compliant DAAPP is to include a clear statement that your institution will impose sanctions on students and employees who violate the standards of conduct contained in your DAAPP. And in addition to that clear statement, you're actually expected to list and describe any sanctions that a student or an employee may face for violating your standards of conduct. So this is not just providing a range of sanctions. This is actually giving folks a sense of what types of sanctions they might face. As you read the text on this slide, you'll see that the department expects that among the options you list as potential sanctions, you include expulsion or dismissal, whatever term you call that permanent separation of a student from your institution, as well as termination of employment for those employees that violate the standards of conduct contained in your DAAPP. This does not mean the Department of Ed expects that you will, in every or even most cases, expel students or terminate employees when they violate your DAAPP. It just means that those must be clearly identified as options and explain what those and other sanctions mean. So once you have all 5 of these items rolled up into a single comprehensive document, you have built a DAAPP and you are ready to now distribute it and proceed with the biennial review process. Before I jump into talking about the biennial review, are there any questions that have come in about what we've talked about so far? Laura?
Yes, there are. There are a couple of great questions, and I see one just came in the group discussion pod as well. So I'm going to point you two that are connected. So on the slide, I'm going to go back 2 points. Within this slide, Mike, where you say under number 2, a description of the applicable legal sanctions under local, state, or federal law. Some folks are asking if that should rather say and, because you would need to describe the legal sanctions under all of those, local laws, state laws, and federal laws. I'm assuming you're making that distinction if there are differences between those 3 types of laws. But the questions from the group are, you mean that we need to address all of those laws, though, correct?
Yeah, so it's actually written as or in the regulations, but you should read it as though the word that appears on that slide is and, because the expectation is that all 3 tiers are covered. And some schools that have gone through the program review process and had inadequacies in their DAAPP didn't address, for example, local sanctions, or they didn't address federal sanctions. So the moment that one of those is missing, you are out of compliance. So one of the things I recommend, particularly in the local sanctions front, because there will be sanctions at the state and federal level, if you've conducted an exhaustive review and there are no specific local laws or ordinances that relate specifically to unlawful possession or distribution of alcohol or other drugs, I would say that out loud in your DAAPP so it's clear to the consumer that might be viewing it that the reason it's not there is because it doesn't exist. I would incidentally make certain that that is the case, but if it is, I would include it just to show that you've addressed all 3 tiers as required.
Thank you so much, Mike. Yeah, it's helpful to distinguish that there, and also I think David is also saying this in our chat that is statutory language, that's local, state, or federal law, for the simple reason of, whether that applies in your area, because you might be in an area where you have state or local laws that speak to this that are different from federal laws. An example of that being, excuse me, another question that came through in the group discussion pod around variances between policy and then state or local laws, in particular right now around cannabis, for example. So, Mike, I'm going to pause you for a second just so you can take a breath. David offered to chime in about that kind of distinction, as he is out in Colorado, so has some firsthand experience with the law differentials there. So, David, would you want to speak to that? And Mike, obviously chime in if you have anything to add as well.
Well, absolutely, and I feel like as a representative from Colorado, I'm often asked to speak about what's going on with our state and cannabis, and obviously some of the conversation that's then carried over nationally. There hasn't been any particular guidance, but past guidance around medical use or for adult use, because we try not to use the term recreational here in Colorado. For adult use hasn't been issued by the Department of Ed, but if we look back at some of the comments that were made around medicinal regulations, the department said, this is defined federally, and you need to think about illicit substances as defined federally. So institutions of higher education, in compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, and in the creation of their drug and alcohol prevention efforts, need to continue to treat cannabis as an illicit substance, even though under state law there may be situations in which 18, 19, and 20-year-olds could use with a medical recommendation, or folks who are 21 and up may be able to use as part of regular adult purchase. So that is continues to be treated as an illicit substance because it is treated as an illicit substance at a federal level.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David, for that. And what I can speak to as well in terms of the college campus side of things, yes, you are correct in that even if your state has differing laws about the legality of cannabis, for example, your institutional policies can still prohibit the possession or use of that substance because, again, yes, you are, complying with federal laws because you receive federal funding, et cetera. Clery makes some different distinctions about how you would count the possible arrests or referrals, or referrals that would be happening on your campus, but that is a separate webinar altogether, and I can answer that question independently. A couple of other questions that are coming up here, though, Mike, that I would want you to be able to speak to. I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but I think you can explain this more succinctly. Is this the same as the Edgar 86 report? Mike, do you want to answer that question?
So I
guess the question is, is DFSCA the same as Edgar 86?
Yeah, so Edgar 86 is, as I mentioned, just the Education Department's General Administrative Regulations, and Part 86 is where these requirements related to complying with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act are published. I've not heard of a specific Edgar 86 report. I have to imagine that if somebody used that terminology, they're probably talking about the biennial review report that we're going to be discussing, more so than the DAAPP, which should be thought of more as akin to an institutional policy, more so than a report per se.
Got it. That makes sense. That makes sense, Mike. And there are a couple other questions here I think are helpful for all of us to chime in on real quick. So in terms of the ASR, there is a question about, like, can the DAAPP be included in the ASR? So for Clery purposes, for what you need to include in your ASR in relation to drug and alcohol abuse prevention information, you could include your entire drug and alcohol abuse prevention program description. So the information that you use to annually notify your community, you could include all of that in your ASR, or you could cross-reference to it, meaning you could put a link in your ASR that takes people to that information. What this person's question might be getting to, so Mike, I'd want you to chime in on this, is does publishing the DAAPP within an ASR constitute the annual notification of the DAAPP to your campus community? I know there are a couple of barbs with that, but I want to defer to you to answer that question.
Sure. The short answer is no, and for a pretty detailed discussion about why the answer is no, you could dive into the Campus Crime Program Review Report from Penn State University, because essentially in that audit, the department went through some trouble to sort of explain that trying to distribute your DAAPP on the same cycle as you distribute your annual security report without having other procedures in place would not meet the requirements. And if you think about it this way, imagine a visiting faculty member who was just teaching at your institution in the spring, who's no longer there in the fall. If you distribute your DAAPP exclusively through inclusion in your annual security report in September, then that is an employee that would not have been provided the DAAPP in counter of the law. So I actually recommend people think about distributing the DAAPP not on the same cycle as the annual security report, but I think it's more useful to approach the distribution component from a calendar year perspective. Get this out early in January to anyone who's a student enrolled in that first term or anyone who is a current employee of the institution, and then build some procedures in place to make sure that students who enroll later in the year that weren't enrolled earlier when the DAAPP was initially distributed, or employees that are hired after that, campus-wide distribution of the DAAPP in January, have some processes in place to make sure that as people are onboarding, they're being provided with a DAAPP as well. That will get you into compliance with the distribution requirements. Relying solely on distribution of your annual security report will not.
That's a really good distinction. Thank you, Mike. And then I think the only other question I wanted to get to right now, this one of, I know the DAAPP is biannual. Is this by institution? If this by institution or on odd, even years? I think Mike is going to get to this, but I am pretty sure I can answer with confidence. The DAAPP needs to be published annually, shared with your campus community annually. The biennial review is what is done every other year. I literally always look up what the word biennial means before I say it, because it's not one that I use all that often, so I can say with confidence it is every other year. And yes, because of when DFSCA was put into place, it is on the even years. So 2020 is the next year that you would have to be conducting your biennial review. And so with that, I think there is another question here about, are there any tips or resources to find current local, state, or federal laws? So, Mike, I don't know if you want to speak to that. We're actually going to get to how you compose all this information in a little bit with David. So I think I might at this point pause, actually. And if there's a question, a response that you want to chime in with that for Mike, you can do that, and then we can move on to your next couple of sections.
I think that sounds like a great plan. And so before we start the poll, I will just acknowledge there was one other question that it looks like sort of popped up that's probably worth addressing, and that is, can you simply provide a link to some of this information in your DAAPP? And I want you to think about this very similar to how you think about or should be thinking about your annual security report. This cannot be a link farm. You must include all required content between sort of the front and back cover of the document that is your DAAPP. So while you can link to supplemental resources, if there's something that I talked about as having to be in your DAAPP, like the ASR, it would not be adequate to provide a link to make the consumer go looking for that information. So you'll need to make sure that it's actually in your DAAPP. Having said that, before I jump into the next part of the webinar, I'd like to invite folks to participate in a quick poll. And so if you can answer as candidly as you are comfortable answering, when was the last calendar year your institution conducted a biennial review in compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act? I'll give it about another 10 seconds for folks to chime in. All right. So it looks like in general, we have the plurality of you indicating, in fact, about 2/3 of you indicating that the most recent biennial review you conducted occurred in 2018, which is excellent. About 14% of you indicated before 2015, or maybe never. There's a little bit of wiggle room in there. And so here's just what you should know about sort of the schedule. Sometimes this can be confusing. So the law went into effect in 1990, even though it was passed in 1989. So the first year institutions had to conduct a biennial review actually was in 1992. So the convention has been, this is not a strict requirement of the law, that the review occur in the even-numbered calendar years, and that the review look back at the two most recent academic years. So if you think about the academic year kind of ending in the spring or summer, fall of even-numbered years is when most institutions that are conducting reviews are really gearing up and gathering their data and beginning to synthesize it towards production of a biennial review report. So there's some guidance from the department that says, by the end of the calendar year in even-numbered years, that's really when the process should be completed and a report filed. So think about December 31st of even-numbered calendar years as the deadline to complete these. Again, that's not a strict standard, but if you get off cycle, then either that suggests that you're either doing it more frequently than biennially, or it means somewhere you got off kilter. Here's what I really want you to focus on, though. If you've not completed a review in either 17 or 18, you should not let the 2019 calendar year close without doing one, because that would clearly mean you're not in a every other year cycle. So just pay attention to that. All right, let me quickly review the biennial review requirements and some challenges, and then pass it over to David to provide some insights as to some strategies that you can employ to meet those challenges. So the statutory text that talks about the biennial review requirements is on this slide and the next slide. And what you should be aware of is that there are some primary goals of the biennial review process. First and foremost, this is an exercise to assess the effectiveness of your institution's abilities to prevent and respond to the illicit use and abuse of alcohol and other drugs. So this should really be a meaningful exercise. One of my favorite quotes, reading Department of Ed program reviews, and when you do that quite a bit, you have to find something to get excited about in terms of how they talk about some of these things. They've recycled this line a couple of times, and I just think it's curious the way they say it. Each review should be a probative inquiry into the actual effectiveness of the program and not merely a conclusory ratification process. That is a very interesting way to say, don't just rubber stamp existing efforts and pat yourself on the back. This should be a meaningful assessment to determine whether what you're doing is working, and if not, develop a plan to do better in the future. That is the essence of the biennial review process. In that process, though, you do have to determine and make available some statistics, namely We're talking about statistics concerning the number of alcohol and drug-related violations that occur on your campus or as part of institutional activities, as well as the number of alcohol and other drug-related fatalities. In addition, the biennial review requirements now also expect you to publish statistics about the number and type of disciplinary sanctions that you're imposing on students and employees, again, for violations and fatalities that are occurring on your campus or at institution-associated activities that have some nexus to alcohol and other drugs. So those statistics are important. By the way, those only sit currently in the statute. Those were added as requirements during the last higher ed reauthorization. They've not yet migrated to regulations. So you have to do a little bit of a piecemeal approach to understand what are the full requirements, although they are all now in your slide deck. Finally, the biennial review, you're expected to, as part of the process, conduct some analysis to determine when you're imposing disciplinary sanctions on students and employees. Are you treating similarly situated students and similarly situated employees in a similar manner from a sanctions perspective? The law requires you to be consistent in your application of sanctions for alcohol and other drug violations. So the biennial review process affords you an opportunity, which you should read as obligation, to actually assess the extent to which you are in fact consistently applying your sanctions to those populations for alcohol and other drug violations. All of this should result in the production of a written report to memorialize your conclusions and your data and your forward-focused recommendations. So there's no obligation to distribute this biennial review report to members of your campus community that only exists with respect to your DAAPP. And you're not required to publish this on a website or make it widely available, although certainly to do so in the spirit of transparency and accountability may be advisable. What you are required to do is give it to anyone who asks for it. Doesn't matter who they are or why they want it. If somebody makes a request for a biennial review report, you are expected to provide it to them. And that, of course, includes the Secretary of Ed during program reviews, which, spoiler alert, if you've not had one recently, it's a customary practice now, whether it's a general Title IV program review or a campus safety and security focused review that's being conducted by the Clery Act Compliance Division, to ask for, among other things, the two most recent biennial review reports authored by your institution. So we go back to a statement I made just a couple minutes ago. If you've not done a review in 17 or 18, but not let 2019 pass without doing one, and then get back on sort of the conventional cycle of doing another one in 2020, odds are if you're doing one in 2019 after having not done one 2 years prior, you're probably, that's probably indicative of some larger compliance issues, and so you want to use the process in 19 to identify those and develop a plan to remedy those so that when you do another analysis in 2020, you can show some improvement. And incidentally, if you get called in for a program review in 2021 and you provide the two most recent biennial review reports, you're providing the two that you have from 19 and 20, and perhaps that will work out well. All right, let me just offer a couple thoughts and some challenges. We'll take any new questions that have come in briefly and then pass the baton to David. So very often there are some key challenges that rise to the top that I see through doing consultations with institutions around drug-free schools and community act compliance or trainings or reading program review reports, which I just wanted to distill some of the more commonplace ones in my experience. One is that very often I see a single person or office shouldering the burden of conducting a review and writing a report on their own. But given the various individuals who need to be involved in the effort, and David's going to talk about who some of those folks or offices are, this really shouldn't be a one person or one office show. In fact, the Department of Ed's handbook even talks about if the president is not personally involved in the process, then a representative of your president or chancellor ought to be. So this is really expected to be a multidisciplinary type work group, not just one person or office. I mentioned earlier that there's a requirement to assess the consistency of sanction enforcement. There should be evidence of that in your biennial review report. I often find when folks ask me to look at their reports, it's one of the first things I look for because it's usually absent. make sure in the biennial review process you're conducting some meaningful assessment of sanction consistency and then transferring those results to your biennial review report. Somebody should be able to read that document upon request and know exactly whether you believe you are or are not consistently sanctioning students and employees. And if you're not, know what your plan is to be more consistent in the future. Oftentimes, as I see with the DAAPP as well, the biennial review is focused almost to the detriment on students. But remember, this law applies to students and employees. So sometimes the reason that the biennial review focuses more on students is because you're simply doing more with students preventively, as well as having more disciplinary interactions and conversations with students. So it's not unexpected that students would occupy a large volume of your focus, but don't not talk about employees as well. They must also be addressed in the biennial review process and in the report that follows it. We see often those statistics I mentioned on the earlier slides are missing. Again, that's probably in part a consequence that unless you notice those requirements being added in the last Higher Ed Reauthorization Act, they just simply haven't gotten into your biennial review reports. That's easily correctable moving forward, though. And finally, the last major challenge I see is that often in the reports, there's not a discussion of what data sources were analyzed and how. What were the specific analysis techniques or evaluation methods employed to ultimately determine the central question of the review process, which is what you're doing effective? Is it making a difference? And how do you know, right? So those questions should be answered in the final biennial review report. And you don't have to be a statistician to do this, although incidentally, you probably have a few at your institution that you might want to loop into the process as a way of engaging people beyond the traditional players. So again, I'll let David talk about that, but before I pass the baton, are there any questions at this point, Laura?
Oh yes, there are some lovely questions here. So, and this also might be something that David can speak to, so I actually might transition us over to David and then we can touch on all of these at the end. But two questions that came through that are applicable right now are, where is the biennial report filed? And then also, there was a question, I'm just going to read it aloud. I understood that you said earlier that the DAAPP distribution requirements are enhanced. So how does this differ from the on request in the, oh, I see, I think, sorry, the question's cutting off me, but it's something connected to this idea of how does this differ from the providing it upon request. So the correct in that the DAAPP is required to be provided annually to all students and employees. And then the on-request element that you're thinking of might be more connected to the Clery Act annual security report, but we can get into those distinctions after David has had a chance to go through his material. So if you want to, David, address initially this idea of where the biennial report is filed, that would be great. So then I'm going to pass it over to you so we have enough time for you to get through all your content.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I can speak to both of those questions. Where it's on file really will depend on where your campus would need to go to look for it. I, as a practice, when I was on campus, I had this on file with my chief executive's office, the president's office, and then within my office as well, so that it was accessible in a couple of different places. That, of course, is referring to the biennial review, though. So when you're thinking about this on request, it's for someone to request the evaluation that you're going to be doing every other year, the biennial review document. That Mike spoke to, the requirements surrounding. So remember, there's a slight difference between the annual notification we're doing for folks that there is a level of service available, there are sanctions, there are health risks associated with this, and then the other part of that is how often do we evaluate our drug and alcohol prevention efforts, and that is required to happen on a biennial or every other year basis. So I'm really stoked that one of the things that Mike let off on a weakness that we see with campuses is that they just say, you know what, this is one person's responsibility and they're going to get it done. It is impossible to be successful if that's the way that a campus is going to approach evaluating an effort that crosses faculty, staff, and students and is really about how an entire campus responds to drug and alcohol prevention. So one of the huge recommendations that we make prior to even getting started in your evaluation process is to make sure that you've got a team. And I like to think about this as being two parts of a unit. One being a very core and central team that's going to do a lot of work, is going to be responsible for writing the report that will all end up through one editor in a finalized version, but is representative of a larger group and what I think of as the full team that really has representatives from across campus who are there to provide input and may be assigned to this work but less interested in it. And that's fine. Voices can come from all over our campuses. And I think one of the things that you also heard in Mike's presentation is that the faculty staff need to be treated as well as the students when we think about our drug and alcohol prevention and our related prevention efforts. So having a representative, for example, from Student Affairs and a representative from Human Resources at a minimum would be required in sort of your core group presence. Another thing that's really going to help you all get moving and get moving forward with your review process is to have an administrative charge, to have some sort of charge by institutional leadership. It'd be amazing if that was the president's office. Where I often see that reflected is in vice presidents and vice chancellors for student affairs. That officially invites folks to participate in this team, gives them sort of the authority with which to do so, and talks about why this is important. And another thing that might be really valuable and should be part of your review process is whether or not this lives in policy. Of course, when I was on campus, I was approached by our compliance office probably the third or fourth day into my job, and an officer said, you know, according to 12.1.1.2, you were responsible for the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act compliance. Here you go, which was not exactly what you want on the second or third day of work, but it was nice because it gave me an importance and a timeliness for my responsibility to convene this group of people and to put a biennial review together. So what does the team do when you've got it together? We want to first think about what our assessment data is on campus and what sort of what we're doing with that information. We want to review and inventory all the programs that are part of our overall and holistic prevention efforts. We want to think about whether or not that holistic program is effective, review, inventory, and evaluate both our campus policies, our violations, and our sanctions, and then to make recommendations to improve the program. And I'll be speaking about each of these independently to give a sense of how you can put this review together, and then offer some resources for you all to get started on this process if you're part of the 14% who answered that it's been a little while since you've done a biennial review. So first we want to review assessment data, and that would include any formal or informal data that you're collecting around alcohol and other drug use, behaviors, and perceptions on your campus. This might include some very common national assessments like the CORE survey or the National College Health Assessment. It may be something that you participate with at a state level, as does folks at Missouri through Missouri Partners in Prevention, a statewide coalition, or it may even be a homegrown survey on your campus that you use to assess and get this information. If you don't feel like you're getting any of information from any of those sources, you may want to look to your broader team to see if they've collected any information from an informal basis, if questions have been added to, say, a housing survey. This is a place to gather all of the information and to show it off. If you've been doing a biennial review every 2 years, this is your opportunity to also show trend data to start to think about where you've been for the past decade as a campus, and that's going to help communicate whether or not you've been keeping a pulse on this, looking for trends that may be emerging, or looking for proof of the efficacy of your prevention efforts to actually make a difference in some of the campus cultures that lead to higher risk alcohol and other substance use. If your group has any concerns about the data that's being collected, it's also pretty critical to address that here. So right now, if you're thinking, uh-oh, I don't have any data, it's not great. I won't lie to you all, but it's probably important to call attention to that and then to create a plan to bridge that gap per sort of the theme of this series. As practitioners and as researchers and as administrators, it is also our responsibility to identify where gaps are and then sort of figure out how we're going to get across that. And so this is a great opportunity to say, you know what, we got together, we looked under every rock, we couldn't find a shred of data, But what we need to do is find a way to collect that so that the next time we meet for a biennial review, we have some things to go off of. And then depending on where your campus is, there may be some relevance in using local or state data, either as a comparison for your subpopulation or as part of the other efforts or initiatives that you're doing. So if you've got a community college, for example, might really benefit from thinking about grabbing some county health data related to substance abuse prevention, or maybe even state data so that you could think about how your campus is part of your community. This is just good prevention practice that you want to display with your work in the biennial review. For task 2, we want to review and inventory our prevention programs, and this is about getting everything together that you do involving alcohol and other drug prevention in your work. That can include your active and passive program work that can be at a practitioner level, a student level, whether that's happening through a student organization like peer educators, all the way up through administrative efforts like policies that you've got. This should be a very wide net, and one of the things that we recommend doing is having folks do program or inventories to be able to have an understanding of what's being offered. This can include things per some recommendations from the college AIM that may be more environmentally structured, like alcohol-free alternatives. And then we evaluate those programs. We evaluate programs based on the criteria that are involved in those programs, whether that's a program-specific goal or outcome, or the way in which it contributes to the holistic goals that we have on campus. So if I was working on a college campus, and I saw 2 years ago our biennial review said that our binge drinking rate was at 65%. That's folks endorsing a binge drinking question in the last 2 weeks, much higher than the national average. I want to say, okay, how can we make some changes to that statistic through a holistic effort and use that to evaluate my work? But each individual unit will also have an evaluation strategy, whether those are student learning outcomes or process outcomes. You may also be able to evaluate your programs based on a typology. I love what the College Alcohol Interventions Matrix or College AIM does for this to allow typology to exist, whether we know that we have programs that are highly effective and reaching across the social ecology or not. And if you haven't checked out the College AIM yet, that's a great way for you to sort of think about the way in which your campus alcohol and drug programs can fit. Are we doing highly effective strategies for individuals, for groups, and for the overall environment? And then in what ways are our programs contributing to that population level measurement? That can include use and behavioral rates, attitudes and behaviors that you would find again on things like CORE or NCHA. But one of the things we want to be really cautious about is using disciplinary sanctions as a way to consider program effectiveness and success. I see a lot of people setting themselves up for success. Well, we had 20 residence hall violations this semester. We're going to get it down to 10. That actually might be indicative of you creating a problem and a lack of reporting and a lack of bystander intervention among your students. Disciplinary sanctions are important to document, but with at least at a student level, this is also about creating a culture of being able to have some educational programs address discipline in an earlier space than later down the road. A lot of folks might be having a little bit of a moment here and thinking, oh, I don't evaluate my programs at all. Well, better not work on that biennial review, but don't do that. Even if the programs didn't purposefully have an evaluative component in advance, figure out if you as a team can evaluate it after the effect. For folks who are around, can you offer some sort of qualitative data around student participation, faculty, staff, utilization? And if not, that's okay too. Just make sure that we document that process so that there can be information in the biennial review about that. I did see that there was a question came up that should students be on a biennial review team? I would love for student voice to be included on your biennial review team. And that can be captured in a couple different ways, whether you use your associated student government or you use peer educators. What I would caution is you probably want a student to be involved who has some interest in contributing voice and not just a student there for the sake of having a student there, because that's not per se necessary. I'd only want a student to be involved if they felt like they could really be contributory to it. Tasks 4 and 5 are about evaluating our campus policies, violations, and sanctions. So just like programs, we want to list all of the campus policies that we've got involving alcohol and other drugs, and this needs to include policies that are outside of student affairs. Again, thinking about faculty and staff, and in some instances, even thinking about guests to our institution. So if your institution, for example, has a large alumni base who really care about their school, and they want to get married there, where are the policies that address having alcohol at social functions by guests at your institution, and are those being evaluated for, just like Mike said, being treated the same, knowing how to detect policy violations, and being able to sort of rectify those if they do happen. So a really wide net needs to get cast here as well in order to capture all of the things that our campus does to prevent misuse throughout the institution. And then finally, the team needs to make recommendations. We have to identify anything that we saw that may have been a compliance concern. We took a look at it, and we did get this out every November to all faculty, staff, and students. That was great. But we forgot that new people come in every day, and we haven't really addressed a new way to get an annual notification in front of folks who maybe got hired after that November date. That's a really great thing for you all to say, we noticed this, and we're going to put a plan to place to make it better. And we have to document those recommendations in our improving areas so that we can continue to take a look at our growth as a drug and alcohol prevention program. And you can see that doesn't have to be super complicated. We can bucket these throughout our report and even put them together in a sort of executive summary to be able to say, here's what we found and here's what we want to do with that, so that this can really be a living and strategic document. We make recommendations that when folks want to put a biennial review report together, that they think really critically on how they want that to look and be framed. And one of the greatest recommendations around this is to make sure that we're actually using a format that makes sense to us. So I've attached in the resources section a sample format for your biennial review that includes all of the various areas and ways that you could craft this experience, along with those things that are absolutely mandatory. And that one thing that's sort of missing from that Mike talked about, and you all want to find a way to include in the work that you do, is how you really truly are looking at the provision of sanctions across faculty, staff, and students, and the way in which that's being evaluated for not just its effectiveness as an overall programmatic aspect, but also whether or not it's being treated fairly and the same across the board. And I do recognize we're running a little short on time, so I might skip this question section just so that I can wrap up with a couple of ways for practitioners in the room to take this from a federal requirement into more of a planning document. Even though this is required by federal law, and I know that a lot of you on the line are very interested in your institution not being levied a $57,000 fine, there's a spirit of drug-free schools that is actually really beautiful and important for our campuses to do good quality substance abuse prevention work. And that changes the drug-free schools biennial review from this really compliance-heavy, where does it have to live, who do I have to tell about it, into how are we really going to make things better for faculty, staff, and students at our institutions of higher education so that they do not experience problems associated with illicit substance or alcohol use. And one frame of that is to use your biennial review to sort of track your process through what SAMHSA calls the Strategic Prevention Framework, or the SPIF. And the Strategic Prevention Framework does allow for us to think about things very similarly to how the biennial review asks us to think about it. What's going on our campus or in our environment right now? How do we get capacity, or what capacities are we missing in order to be able to address those needs? How can we be strategic about that, to put that to play, implement it, and then evaluate its success? So the SAMHSA SPIF, which is the community model for substance abuse prevention, can live and be reflected in our campus's biennial review. And hopefully what that ends up doing is to build administrative buy-in beyond the fact that we need to check this box. It absolutely is required. But it's the chance to tell our prevention story on campus. And as Mike said, and I was so excited to hear it, this is not a document that says everything is awesome about our drug and alcohol prevention, because it probably isn't. Drug and alcohol prevention efforts have not kept up with a lot of the prevention science that's happening in the community at a campus level, and it's important to call attention to that, because that's the accountability we're going to be held to. We need to show what's needed on our campus, and we need to build an understanding and support each other across these various sectors and across the diverse voices that will get represented on your biennial review team, so that we truly and honestly, 2 years later, will have a better program to report out on. So I'm going to hand it back over to Laura to wrap us up, but one question that we had hoped folks would report in on is what strategies they've used in the past to conduct a biennial review of your institution's drug and alcohol prevention program.
Yes, thank you so much, David. Would love for folks to answer that question. I know a lot of folks, I think brains are spinning maybe a little bit right now with a lot of the valuable information that you were sharing. So a couple of questions that I can answer while folks are submitting their answers to this question. There were a couple of questions that were seeming to maybe conflate or confuse data that would be analyzed within the biennial review with information that is in your annual security report in your Clery crime statistics. So just a reminder that the information in your annual security report is going to be possibly, well, it is distinct. It's a distinct set of data that might not encompass everything that you would be including in your biennial review, because it is capturing reports of Clery crimes that occurred within Clery geography. So for alcohol and drug incidents, you're talking about those in reference to arrests and referrals. But again, only arrests and referrals that take place within your Clery geography for actions that are also violations of state or local law. So the information in your biennial review presumably would extend beyond that set of data, because you are talking about incidents that maybe happen anywhere that your campus becomes aware of, and that are not necessarily tied to just possession, use, and sale of alcohol or illegal drugs, but other actions as well that might be connected to alcohol and drug use per se. So yes, we would love to get some more information or responses on what strategies you've used to conduct this biennial review. I see some reports are coming through, some responses are coming through. One sharing that they were on a panel with the dean and others. I'm unsure of the situation or the process at your current institution. Okay. And I mean, I would be curious here to know if it was, I know we are running low on time, but if this was like a one-person job, if this was a process that took 3 months, if this is a process where you had a subcommittee or multiple subcommittees involved, was this the work of an institutional team that had a charge like David was speaking to earlier, or was this your department? So waiting for folks to share some responses there. One thing that was mentioned, the template report was mentioned. Where is the link to that? So that template is in the files pod where it says DFSCA Biennial Review right there. So you should find that there. And then another response that came through is they work with several campuses around the country, and they do training on reviews with campus presidents. We also have survey forms we send to each campus to find out about activities, et cetera. So it sounds like that's a coalescing of information for maybe a system or a larger institution that has locations in multiple places. So all of these things are super helpful. I'm sure, again, a lot of folks might be thinking through these answers as we are running a little bit low on time. So I do want to make sure that we get to these last couple of elements connected to Clery. So as we have said in a couple of different places, Clery requires that you include a description of an institution's substance abuse education programs or drug and alcohol abuse prevention programs, your DAAPP. You can do that in 2 ways. You can include all of the information that needs to be within a DAAPP within your ASR. So in theory, you could include the DAAPP annual notification that you're already writing in its entirety within your ASR. But as we often get feedback that ASRs can become lengthy and bulky, we would sometimes recommend that campuses do the cross-reference. But again, as Mike and David were both getting into, the cross-reference should then be to materials that fully answer all of these required elements and that don't necessarily contain a lot of other cross-references in and of themselves. So make sure that what you are cross-referencing to is complete information that satisfies these elements. That is one of the areas that has come up most recently in the past 5 years of campuses just not making that connection. The cross-references within an ASR are taking folks to something that is not accurate. So you would want to double-check what that cross-reference is. We are including at the end of the presentation a bunch of different resources that you all can use to support your efforts around your DAAPP development as well as your biennial review development. I want to give David and Michael a chance to answer any other additional questions or final comments with our last few moments here because we have reached that 3:30 mark. Any last things that you all would like to share?
You know, I think I would come back to a comment that Mike made, which is, yeah, there is a history of this being put together on even-numbered years, but if you truly and honestly don't know the last time you've done a biennial review, please, please, please do not let next 2 months go by without getting some folks together in a room and just having a conversation. Those meeting minutes can become your biennial review until you get yourself into a space that you really can honestly take a good, solid, and clean look at this.
Agreed, agreed. Mike, any closing remarks from you?
Yeah, the only other thing I might suggest is a particular resource that's here, this Resurgence of the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. If you click on that link, you'll be able to download a free white paper that traces the evolution of the modern enforcement area, talks about what's required, and really ends with, so now that you know this, what should you do next, and offer some tangible recommendations and strategies for moving forward. I found that as schools have shared that with other colleagues, that helps provide some common language and a baseline understanding for what are our institutional obligations, and helps give a little bit of a framework for evaluating where are we and where do we need to put some efforts moving forward. So I would encourage you to go check out that white paper. That's the reason that we wrote it, so please circulate that widely as you see fit.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. The one other thing I would want to comment on, because we do get this question a lot, beyond these resources, there isn't a document that's like similar to the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting that's published for DFSCA. There is that document published by, I believe, the Higher Education Commission back in 2006. Is that the most up-to-date resource supplemental to what you have included here that informs folks how to comply with DFSCA requirements? Mike, or you might be on mute if you're speaking.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, that really is the most recent. So you can email clery@ed.gov to get some technical assistance if you have sort of nuanced questions about how to comply. If you email the help desk, the Campus Safety and Security help desk, they will tell you that they're sort of in the Clery lane only. So short of working with an organization like the Clery Center, DAAPP, D.F.S.C.A. and Associates, that's really the only other place where you can get some of that guidance, beyond other just private providers who are out there. So if you have a specific technical question, I have seen people write into clery@ed.gov and get some responses from the auditors. But if you don't want to do that, certainly use the other resources and organizations that are available to you to help support your compliance efforts.
And folks, it looks like we're getting some feedback that the hyperlinks to the DFSCA resources slide are all taking you to the last slide, the last handout rather, which I'm not quite sure why that's happening. That might be something that's happening within Adobe. I would just recommend copying and pasting these links into a browser because they are not for the same document. They are for these separate documents. So because these technically are not hyperlinked. I mean, they are, but they're not the same thing as what this last thing is. So I would just copy and paste these web addresses into a browser in order to get that information. So not sure how that happened, but thanks for pointing that out. All right, folks. Lastly, I've included my contact information and invite David and Mike to do the same. We're also going to share a link for a survey for attendees to complete if you have a moment. Just give us some feedback on this webinar. Mike and David, I know I can speak for everyone when I say thank you so much for the incredibly helpful information you shared today about what the DFSCA speaks to and what the biennial review requires and how folks can best accomplish it. I know this was chock full of information start to finish, so thank you for that. And we really appreciate that everybody's attention today, especially because we're going a few minutes over here. But thank you all again so much for joining us for National Campus Safety Awareness Month this year. This webinar does conclude all of our free webinars this month. So please look for a final email from us that we will send on Monday, where you can provide some feedback on the month's products and resources overall and give us some ideas for NACSAM 2020. Mike and David, thank you both so much again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.